Okay, hi guys. Welcome to the video companion for assignment 2 in the Environmental Tech Programs Data Management course. What we're going to do today is just walk right through all of the tasks that we're going to need to do for assignment 2. So in our Brightspace, we have our Word document, which has our instructions. We can go ahead and download this. And we have our starter spreadsheet, the NHIC document, so we can go ahead and download this. Now I'm just going to open it for my downloads, but you guys are going to want to make sure that you save it somewhere where you can actually get it. So I go ahead and open up our Excel sheet and our Word document. Pull that over here. We can see that we have all of our due dates and things like that, and we have a list of our data, complete with the data reference. We have a couple of links here that will give you a little bit more information on what some of these ranks are for the different species that we're going to be working with. And we're going to, we have some links here for what COSEWIC is, which is the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. And they are the group that ranks species federally to determine what their conservation threat is. So the big part of this assignment is that we're going to work with a massive data set of tens of thousands of lines of data, and we're going to summarize it really quickly and glean some information using a tool called pivot tables. And pivot tables are a really great tool if you have data that are have repeating values in them, or if it's one of those long data sets and you can summarize by a bunch of variables at once. And we use this as the bonus in assignment 1, but for assignment 2, it's going to be kind of the main thing that we're working with. So we're going to open our sheet and we're going to basically answer a bunch of different questions about one of the different taxa that we're interested in. So I'll bring up that sheet right here. So enabling editing. So what we can see is that this is formatted as a table. We have our README tab, which explains the link where I got the data from, what each of the different fields is in the data set itself, and identifies the ones that are key for our purposes in this course to give you an idea about which ones it is that we're actually looking at for these for this assignment. And basically what this is it is a data set of 23,451 species that have been identified in Ontario. And this is maintained by the Natural Heritage Information Centre, the NHIC in Ontario, and they are Ontario's authority on collecting and managing species data for the province. And so it contains a ton of information in here. If you look at each of these different fields, you can see that there's a taxonomic category for the element. Each of them has a unique identification number, 2 different kind of ways that you can identify them, but it also has stuff like your scientific name, your common name, different synonyms if it's been known by a different name. But some of these other fields are the ones that we're going to be interested in, like this one where it's provincially tracked, whether or not the province actively tracks observations of this species. Things like the S rank, which is the subnational rank, and is basically 1 to 5, 1 being really, really critically imperiled, 5 being okay. And then there's also these ones for national, which is the national rank, and then the global. So the S rank is basically 1 to 5, is the species okay in Ontario? The N rank, 1 to 5, is it okay in Canada? And the G rank, 1 to 5, is it okay globally? So if you have a G1 species, it's imperiled globally. If you have a G5 species, it's safe. We also have these other statuses that we're going to take a bit of a special look at with this assignment. And so we have these kind of 3 different bodies. We have the Species at Risk Ontario, CERO. We have COSEWIC, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. And we have SARA, the Species at Risk Act. So basically, there is an Endangered Species Act in Ontario. Ontario keeps a list of whether or not species are ranked as endangered, threatened, special concern, otherwise. And so this is the status of the species for its persistence in Ontario itself. When it comes to the federal status, the status of it throughout all of Canada, we have these other ones where it's CSIWIC. So CSIWIC is the kind of body that does the assessments itself, and they make a recommendation. And then the Canadian system's a little bit slow because the Species at Risk Act requires that species actually be added into the legislation itself. So CSIWIC does an assessment, and maybe they say that a species is endangered or threatened or special concern or something like that. What happens is that goes to a body who every couple of years will add species to the actual legislation, which infers protection. And so the status, they usually take whatever CSIWIC recommends, but not always. And that could be for political reasons or stuff like that, where there might be a difference between what CSIWIC recommends based on the biology and what SARA recommend, or what SARA actually lists them as and when they actually list it. So usually these will be very similar, but they might have a slight discrepancy. So that the rest of the fields aren't necessarily what we're going to need to look at, but there's some other interesting categories that are in here if you wanted to look at it yourself. And so we have the exotic status, whether the element is exotic to Ontario, and we have whether or not they're a restricted species. And so if the species is considered sensitive to public disclosure in Ontario, and that gets at some of these issues around data sensitivity that we've talked about a little bit in class. So with that kind of described, what we're going to do is start to look at this sheet. So we have, again, these 23,000 rows, and we have all the way to AD, so that's about 30 columns. But if we were to try and answer the questions that we have in this sheet, like how many elements are in each of the classes, what % of the total species documented are in that class, then we might have some trouble doing it, right? Because it's a lot of data to work with. We'd have to be able to manipulate and write functions that are, looking for certain things to count them up, and then it would be, a little bit finicky. But what Excel has is a really cool tool that allows us to do this really easily, and that's called pivot tables. And what pivot tables allow you to do is take something like this and then scrunch it up by any repeated values, so that you can either count them or calculate descriptive statistics like our mean, median, and mode, and be able to summarize really, really big data sets really quickly in a way that once you wrap your head around it, can help you to really do some cool stuff. So what we're going to do here is we just go up to Insert, and we're clicked anywhere on this table, and we go to Pivot Table. And when we click Pivot Table, it says, okay, you want a pivot table from a table or range. And the table I've named species. And so it recognizes immediately from being in that we want to use the species table. So we can go ahead and click New Worksheet. And what we'll do is we'll move this over here by just grabbing it with our mouse and dragging it over, and we'll call this Q1, because this is going to be our first question. And the first question that we want to ask is how many elements are in this NHIC class? So we're going to pick one of these, and we're going to try and get some information about it. So the way that we can do that is with this little panel over here that allows us to move things in the pivot table. So this pivot table references all of the data that's in this table, and it gives us each of those different columns so that we can kind of manipulate them into being a filter, being a column, being a row, or actually calculating values. And so the key thing to know here is that when you move things into the filters, columns, or rows, it's going to take each unique value in that thing, and it's going to either apply it as a filter, as a row, or as a column. So what we can do is we can move NHIC class, and what we do is we can either just click this box here, or we can drag it down. So if we just click that box, it moves it to the rows. And what that does is it gives us each of the unique values for the NHIC class. And so in this 23,000 row data set, there are all of these different values: amphibians, birds, bryophytes, bryozoans, blah, 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 blah. All of those different types. And the pivot table recognizes that, and it allows us to then break up all of the entries that are in it by this thing. What we can do now is we can pull something into the values, and what it'll do is it'll count the number of rows that are in each one of those NHIC classes. So we can take this one, which is called the EL code, which if we go back to our README, we can check is a unique ID element or a unique ID for the element. And we can pull that L code and we can just throw it into values. And you'll see what that does is it counts the number of rows that are in where there is each one of these NHIC classes. So it's telling us that there are 31 amphibians in this data set. So to kind of mind check that, what we can do is we can go here, and if we use this little tab button, the little drop down here, we can actually filter in the table itself, and we can unselect all of them and select amphibians just to fact check that our pivot table is doing the right thing. And if we click OK, we can see at the bottom here that there are 31 records of amphibians, and it's telling us that there are 31 records of amphibians. So what this is doing is it's quickly summarizing and giving you a number for all of the rows, and it's adding up to this 23,451 total rows, and it's saying that there are this many rows of each of these different things. And what we can do is if we click on this 31, we can actually organize them by right-clicking and clicking sort. We can organize them by smallest to largest or largest to smallest. So we'll just do largest to smallest like that. And there's all sorts of really cool things that you can do with these pivot tables once we get to kind of work with them a little bit more, but these are kind of some of the simpler things. So we can see that there's the most insects, then vascular plants, lots of lichens, lots of spiders, lots of bryophytes, lots of birds, and then there's a little bit of kind of these other categories, and only one hydrozoan, which is a type of jellyfish identified in Ontario. And what our question is asking us to do is saying how many elements are in this NHIC class. So for whichever element it is that you actually identify, this is your answer, right? If you pick to analyze insects, it'll be 14,570. If you pick vascular plants, 4,210. And so on and so forth. And you just got to make sure that you're kind of picking one of these and sticking with them for the rest of the assignment. So the second question that we have is what percent of the total species documented in Ontario is in this class? So what we do now is we go to our pivot table and we can actually bring this down again. And so we can keep this one calculated as the count of them, but if we bring it down again, it's going to just do a copy of that one. But there's a couple of different ways that we can actually show these. And so instead of just showing it as the count, we can right click on it, and it gives us this option of show values as. And so if we want just the count of it, it goes no calculation. But we can also do any of these other ones, and it'll do the percent of kind of these different groups that are there. But the one that we really need is just the percent of the column total, because what we want is to calculate what is the percentage that each one of these groups represents of the total number of species in Ontario. So we can go ahead and say summarize or show values as percent of column total. And now you'll see that all of these numbers add up to being 100. And you can see that 62% of all of the species identified in Ontario are insects. That's 14,570 over 23,451. And so this is a really quick way that we can get some summaries about all of these different groups that we're seeing. So that's how we do question 1, and it's also actually how we do question 2. The next one that we do is we're going to be doing how many elements in this NHIC class are partially tracked by the NHIC. So what we're looking for is that provincially tracked field that we were talking about before equals Y or P. And so this says to select both in your pivot table, right click and group them. So what we can do is we can actually, if we want to just manipulate the stuff that's in this pivot table, we can make a copy of this sheet, and then it'll just do another sheet that has this pivot table referencing from that other table that we were looking at. So instead of making a new one out of this table, what we'll do is we can just copy this sheet. So we right click and we go to move or copy, and we click move to end and make a copy. Now it says Q1 to 2, but we're actually going to call this question 3 to 4. And now you'll see that these sheets are identical, but we're able to actually manipulate this so that we can do some different counts. And what is it that we want to do? So we want to pick one of these groups that we're going to analyze. I will pick vascular plants because that's what I'm interested in as an example. And then we can calculate how many and what proportion are tracked by the NHIC. So the way that we can do that is we can actually bring NHIC class, instead of having all of these groups, we can bring them up to the filters. And now we can use it as a filter and just pick the group that we want. So here we click this little drop down arrow and it allows us to filter that data set by whichever group we're interested in. You click select multiple items, you unselect all, and then you pick the one that you want to analyze, so vascular plants. Now, this is telling us that there's 4,200, and that's 100% of this column, which is all that it's doing right now. And if we look back, we can compare that, and there are 4,210 vascular plants. And now when we filter this count of EL code for vascular plants, it's only showing us that 4,210. We'll get rid of this for now. We'll leave that percentage, actually, leave it there. Let's bring this provincially tracked now down to rows. So what is this telling us? This is telling us all of the different unique values that are in the provincially tracked. And if we look at this field in it, we can see that there's three different ones, N, P, and Y. And we can see in the README file that the N, P, and Y, which is not there, but it should be. The N, P, and Y it's actually in the instructions, sorry. So Y is tracked, and P is partially tracked, and N is not tracked. So we go back to our pivot table here. So there are 3,289 species of vascular plants that are not tracked by the NHIC. There are 71 that are partially tracked, and there are 850 that are fully tracked. If you wanted to actually see which ones these were, you can double click on pivot tables, and it brings up a new sheet that actually has all of the ones where it is vascular plants that are provincially tracked. That's just an example of how you could do if you were curious about which ones were actually in those. But we can delete this sheet because it's just creating a copy of that data. So these ones are not tracked. We can actually change the values in this table if we wanted to. These are partially tracked, and then these are fully tracked. But the question is asking us how many are partially or fully tracked. So we could either add these two numbers together, which if we just highlight them, we can see that the sum is 21.88. And then the total number of species is 921. We could also use our, equals sum function. We could add those cells, but because I'm showing you the pivot tables, one of the things that we can do is if we actually highlight both of these values by using our white cursor, we can right click and select group. And what that does is it creates this provincially tracked 2, where it's actually the combined grouping that we've just identified for it. And so now we have not tracked, and then we have P or Y. And so now we're getting into kind of one of the cool things about pivot tables, that you can actually nest values within them. And so this is saying within the bold, there are 921, which we already knew, that are partially or fully tracked, which is 21.88%. And then beneath it, it gives us each of the other categories that are within it. We can click these little minuses, and that will collapse them so that we can either show them or not show them. And in our not tracked, we only have this one group, which is not tracked. So that's a cool example of how we can group things and how we can get these proportions. And this would also give you your answer for the quiz. So we would enter these numbers into our quiz in Brightspace, which are available here, and you just enter those numbers into there with making sure that you have just the count or the percentage with 2 decimal places. So that's kind of our first couple questions down. We're going to do one more, and then I'm going to leave our two more, I think, and we're going to make some graphs. So the next one, we've answered this one, the how many are tracked and what proportion is that. And now we can look at how many elements have been assessed under the Ontario Species at Risk Act, SARO, i.e. the SARO status is not blank, means that they actually given it a status. We can use groups again. And then what percent of species have been assessed under the Ontario Species at Risk Act? And again, we're answering just for one of our species groups here. So what we can do again is we can make a copy of this and we can right click, move or copy, or what we can do is we can hover over this sheet, hold the control key, grab it with our mouse, and then you see how this arrow pops up, move it to the side, and that makes a copy as well. So that allows us to, again, have just a copy of the sheet that we were working with, and we'll call this question 5 to 6. So now we're still filtered for vascular plants, which is what we want to do. But instead of having these provincially tracked ones, we can get rid of those. What we want instead is the SARO status. So we grab that, we bring it down. Now what this is telling us is that there are 44 species, 1%, that are listed as END. There are 2 species that are listed as EXP, 15 that are SC, and 23 that are threatened. I have listed out what these are in our sheet here. And so these are what each of those different statuses actually means. There's also more information in those links that are at the top of this so that you can get an idea about what it is that makes a species endangered, threatened, or special concern in Ontario and in Canada under COSEWIC. It's a very similar assessment process. So what we can do, we'll go back to our sheet here. And so we have 44 that are endangered, and we could change that value if we wanted to, or we can just leave it as that. But if we wanted to use those groups again, we know that all the ones where it's blank are basically species where they haven't actually given it a status. So if we look here and we're thinking about, I can filter this for our vascular plants. And we have our SARO status column. So all of these ones where there's no status, it means that SARO hasn't looked at them to give them a status. So what we're going to do is we can call those not assessed by SARO. And if we double click this little thing here, it makes it as wide as the widest entry in that column so that we can actually see all the stuff. If we highlight all of these ones, we can group them together. We can right click and go group. And then we can call these assessed by SARO. And so what we can do now is we again have this two of the same field here that's allowing us to kind of create these groups. And we can see that if we collapse them, 84 species have been assessed by SARO, that's 2%, and 4,126 have not been assessed by SARO. And so that is a relatively large lack of understanding about the conservation status under the only legislation that actually protects species like that in Ontario. So species at risk in Ontario. So that's a little bit of cool information. And again, now you have your answers to kind of get at what we need to do. So for question 7 and 8, and then 8 and 9, or you would be doing largely or 9 and 10, sorry. You would be doing largely the same thing, except instead of looking at SARO, you'll be calculating it for SARA, the Species at Risk Act in Canada, and then for COSEWIC, and you'll be comparing those numbers. But the next thing that I want to do is not actually those. I will leave them to you with kind of the skills that we've done to manipulate those. But we're actually going to practice producing some of these bar charts. And so I have a list here of the things that we want to get. And these are the types of graphs that we're going to shoot for. And we can also, pivot tables are good because it allows you to kind of summarize data and then easily produce stuff like this. So we're going to make just the first one here, which is the SARO status. So we go back here, and I'm going to make a copy of our tape of our one here by, again, I hold the control key, I grab it, and I move it to the end, and we're going to call this Sarah. I'm going to get rid of this grouping so that we just see these again. And we can write out what our actual values are if we just type into that cell. So this one is endangered, extirpated, special concern, threatened, and then we have not assessed by Sarah. What's cool about pivot tables too is you can kind of move these around. We can sort like we did before by right-clicking and doing largest to smallest, but we're actually going to put them in order that we're interested in them. So we might think extirpated is obviously gone, right? So that's our kind of worst status. And then we have endangered as being a greater threat than threatened. And so we have special concern, threatened, and then endangered. And then if they're already gone, then they would be assessed as extirpated. So I'm also going to get rid of the proportions here because we don't need them in the graph itself. So you can either right click or click this little triangle here and remove the field, or you can drag it out to the top and that'll get rid of it. What we can do now is it's very simple to just insert, and we can tell it to make us a bar graph. And in this case, we'll make a 2D column. So again, this is cool because this table is linked to our species table. So if anything changes in this table, we could automatically update this bar graph. But this bar graph is also linked to our pivot table. So if we want, we can actually get rid of, we can change this pivot table and it'll change the values that are on our graph. So for example, this not assessed by Sero kind of reduces the size of these other bars to being so small that we can't actually see them. So we can filter this out by clicking this little arrow here, and then we can get rid of not assessed by Sero by unchecking it. We click OK, and now you'll see that our actual bar graph has changed. We can start to also think about what it is that we actually want on our bar graph by clicking the plus. So we can click we want access titles, obviously, on all of our graphs. We can put data labels or a data table, whichever one you think is more interesting. We can get rid of our grid lines. We can get rid of our legend, and we can get rid of our chart title. Now, pivot tables by a pivot. So this is the pivot table, and this is the pivot chart. And by default, the pivot chart has these little things on it. So we can actually go in here and we could change the filter for the table if we instead wanted to look at, say, reptiles and amphibians. And that would update it for that class. And we could kind of change them as much as we wanted to get the information that we're interested in. But for our purposes, we'll just do that with the table. So we can get rid of these off of the graph itself by right-clicking them and saying hide all of these field buttons on the chart. Now it's starting to look more like a regular graph that we would have in Excel, right? What we're going to do is we can say, let's change the axis title. So we double click on that. And this one is the Sero status. We can go here and we can say number of species or elements in Ontario. And then we can, this graph is starting to look a lot more like something that we would see in a report. We can also, if we click on any of these kind of things that are in the graph, you'll see that we get these options that pop up on the side. So we can actually, you have different options for the different parts of the graph, whether it's the plot area, the horizontal axes, the data table, and we can navigate through those here to change what it is that we want to edit. But that thing will also update if we pick on any of these different things. So I clicked on the title and it goes to title options. I click on the data table and it goes to the data table options. So here you can do stuff like, I'm just going to get rid of these legend keys so that it doesn't have that number there. What I want us to do is, as in this one here, we want to make sure that we're hiding all those stuff. So we've done all that stuff. And now what we're going to do is just change the colors so that they look like this and they kind of represent what that status is. And so if we click on one of the bars, you can see that it highlights all of the bars because these are all there. If we click on one of the bars again, now it's just highlighting one of them. We can go to our color We could change the fill, and we could change what the color is here. So special concern we'll say is like a yellow. We can click on threatened. We can change that to being our orange. We can change endangered to being red. And then we can say if it's extirpated, we'll just make it dark black here. And now you'll see that we have an exact graph that represents this one with 15, 23, 44, and 2, as in our assignment here. And so your responsibility is to do this for your species of choice. You go and you get all of your answers for the different questions. You complete one of your quizzes. And then you have to make these bar graphs for each of the Sero, Kosiwik, and the Sarah. And then we're putting that into a report where we're, again, talking a little bit about our group and the purpose of what our analysis was, which is thinking about what is the conservation status of different groups in Canada. So hope that helps, and looking forward to seeing you in class and your results.